Iffy was in her room trying to sleep when she heard some strange voices. She had just visited Grandpa for the third-term holiday. The strange voices came from Grandpa's room. She listened carefully. The voices were not just one or two. There were many voices, and they were all female. The women laughed and talked, but their voices were low. Who could these women be? Iffy pondered sitting on her bed, while stretching her neck trying to peek through her window. She had not seen them in the house during the day, and Grandpa never told her some persons would come visiting him. The next morning, Iffy decided to ask Grandpa. "Grandpa, I heard many women talking in your room last night. Who are they?" Grandpa's face changed. He looked surprised. He cleared his throat. "Oh, Iffy, they are my friends. They come to help me at night," he said. Iffy was still confused, but she did not ask more questions. Grandpa was an old man, and maybe he needed friends to help him. During the day, Iffy helped Grandpa with house chores. She swept, cleaned, fetched water, and ran errands. She liked helping him. One morning, as she swept the front of Grandpa's room, she saw something strange. It was small, milky, and slippery. She used her broom to push it, but she did not understand what it was. She thought, if it is on the floor, then it should be trash. So, she packed it up with the other dirt and threw it away. The next day, she saw the same thing again. This time, she was curious. She picked it up with a small nylon bag and kept it. Later in the day, she took her phone and searched online. She took a picture of the wet, milky thing and searched the internet. To her surprise, the internet called it a condom. She browsed more and learned that it was used by adults. She read about what it was for and how it was used. But no one was there to explain properly to her. Iffy became more curious. She thought, let me try it myself. That way, I will understand better. She locked herself in the bathroom and opened the used condom. She wanted to practice what she saw on the internet. She tried putting it on her hand and then on her body. In the process, the liquid inside the condom touched her private part. She did not think much about it. Now I know Grandpa's secret, she said to herself, smiling. She felt happy that she had learned something new. But she did not know that she had just put herself into big trouble. Iffy had just turned 14 that November. She had started seeing her period some months ago. That meant she was now growing into a woman. But she did not fully understand how the body worked. A few weeks passed. Then one day, Iffy felt strange. She woke up feeling weak. Her stomach did not feel normal. The next morning, she vomited. She thought maybe it was malaria. But when it happened again the next day, Grandpa became worried. "Iffy, tell me the truth," Grandpa said, looking at her with serious eyes. "Who did you sleep with? This is not ordinary. You vomited yesterday, and now today again. Tell me what you have done." Iffy was confused. She did not understand what was happening. She had not done anything wrong. The only thing she remembered was playing with the used condom. But she did not think that could be a problem. Grandpa took her to the local chemist. He wanted to find out what was wrong. "Test her," Grandpa told the chemist. The chemist ran a test and came back with the result. He looked at Grandpa and Iffy and then said something shocking. "She is 3 weeks pregnant." Iffy's eyes widened. "Pregnant? How?" she asked, confused. Grandpa was in shock. "Who is responsible? Tell me now," he shouted. Iffy could not talk. She started crying. She did not know what to say. She did not sleep with anyone. She was sure of that. But how did she become pregnant? Grandpa kept asking, "Tell me what you did. Tell me who touched you." But Iffy had no answer. The only thing she remembered was the used condom. The house was silent, but tension filled the air. Iffy sat on the small wooden bench outside, her hands shaking. She had never felt this way before. She was only 14. How could she be pregnant? She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't been with any boy. And yet, the chemist had confirmed it. Grandpa paced back and forth, his face dark with worry. He couldn't understand what had happened. He had lived for 80 years and had never heard of such a thing. How could a girl get pregnant without meeting a man? It was impossible. "Iffy, Grandpa said again, his voice shaking. Tell me the truth. Who did this to you? Iffy sniffled. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. Grandpa, I swear, I don't know. I didn't do anything. Grandpa clenched his fists. His granddaughter was a child. How could she be telling such a terrible lie? Just then, the door burst open. Iffy's mother had arrived from the city, her face a mixture of anger and disappointment. She had rushed down the moment she heard the news. Iffy, she shouted, rushing towards her daughter. What have you done? Iffy bent her head, unable to meet her mother's eyes. Mama, I don't know, she whispered. Her mother was breathing heavily. I sent you here so you would be safe, not so you would disgrace me. She turned to Grandpa. Papa, what is going on? How did this happen? Grandpa sighed deeply, his eyes filled with sorrow. That is what we are trying to find out, he said. She says she has never been with any man. Iffy's mother looked at her daughter again, her eyes softening. She could see the confusion and fear in Iffy's eyes. Could it be that she was telling the truth? Tell me everything, she said gently, holding Iffy's hands. Between sobs, Iffy explained everything. How she had been sweeping the front of Grandpa's room. How she had found the milky substance. How she had been curious and had searched online to find out what it was. How she had used the used condom to practice what she saw on the internet, not knowing she was putting herself in danger. There was silence. Grandpa's face turned pale. He staggered backward, his hands covering his mouth. Iffy's mother gasped and took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. No, Grandpa whispered. That is not possible. Iffy's mother grabbed her head. You mean, you got pregnant from? Her voice trailed off, unable to say the words. Grandpa sat down, his whole body trembling. Iffy's mother turned to face him, her face full of rage. Papa, how could you be so careless? She shouted. How could you leave such things lying around when you knew a child was here? Grandpa did not answer. He was lost in thought. This had never happened before. Could it really be true? Was he, the father of Iffy's unborn child? Iffy, her mother said suddenly, we must do a DNA test. We have to be sure. The next week felt like a dream. They traveled to the city, where the test was conducted. The wait was unbearable. Iffy barely ate or slept. Her mother was restless, pacing around the house. Even Grandpa, who was usually strong and confident, looked weak and tired. Finally, the results came. Grandpa held the envelope in his hands. His fingers trembled as he opened it. He read the results once, twice, 3 times. Then he dropped the paper and covered his face with his hands. Iffy's mother picked up the paper and read it. Her hands flew to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. It's true. Grandpa let out a deep, painful sigh. He had fathered his own granddaughter's child. Even though it was unintentional, it was still a terrible shame. Iffy sat still, staring into space. She did not understand much about DNA, but the reaction of the adults told her everything she needed to know. Her worst fears had been confirmed. Her mother fell to the floor, crying. This cannot happen, she said. My daughter cannot carry this child. She cannot be married to my own father. Never. She turned to Grandpa, her eyes filled with rage. You must do something. This child must not be born. Grandpa looked up at her, his face full of sorrow. No, he said firmly. She is too young. If she tries to remove the baby, she might die. So you want her to give birth? Iffy's mother shouted. And then what? She will marry you? Grandpa shook his head. I don't know. But killing the child is not an option. Silence fell upon them. The weight of the situation pressed down on their shoulders. Iffy wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She had always been a curious girl, but she had never imagined that her curiosity would lead her to this. What do we do now? She asked in a small voice. No one had an answer. The truth had been revealed, but it left more questions than answers. Iffy's mother sat on the wooden bench in front of Grandpa's house, her face buried in her palms. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to process what she had just heard. The weight of shame and disbelief pressed heavily on her chest. How could this happen? How could her little girl, just 14, carry such a burden? Grandpa sat quietly on his bamboo chair, staring into space. His once proud and confident expression was gone, replaced by deep regret. He had always been careful, or so he thought. But now, his carelessness had brought disgrace not just to him but to his entire family. Iffy, still in shock, sat beside her mother. She didn't understand why she was being blamed. She hadn't done anything wrong, or at least, she hadn't thought she did. Her young mind was still trying to grasp the reality of pregnancy. Her stomach was still flat, nothing about her body had changed. But the test at the chemist said otherwise. "Mama, I swear, I don't know how this happened," Iffy said softly, looking at her mother with pleading eyes. "I never lay with any man." Her mother lifted her head, her eyes red from crying. "Then how do you explain this? You are pregnant, Iffy. A child is growing inside you. How do you not know how this happened?" she cried. I only tried on those rubber things Grandpa left," Iffy mumbled, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Her mother clenched her fists. She turned sharply towards Grandpa, her voice filled with anger. "Papa, how could you? How could you be so reckless? Leaving such things where a child could find them?" Grandpa swallowed hard. "I never thought, never imagined she would touch them. How could I have known she would experiment with them? She is just a child. You should have been more careful," Iffy's mother yelled. The argument grew louder, and the villagers started gathering. Word had already spread through the village that something terrible had happened in Grandpa's house. People whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was going on. Soon, the village chief arrived, his walking stick tapping against the ground as he approached. "What is all this noise about?" he asked, looking at the distressed family. Iffy's mother turned to him, her voice trembling. "Chief, my daughter is pregnant. And the test says the child belongs to my own father." A collective gasp spread through the crowd. People began murmuring, shaking their heads in disbelief. "That is not possible. How can such a thing happen?" one villager asked. "There must be a mistake," another added. The chief narrowed his eyes. "Are you sure about this? Has a proper test been done?" Iffy's mother nodded. "Yes, chief. We did a DNA test. The result confirmed it. It is Papa's child." Grandpa lowered his head in shame. He had never imagined that his secret life would lead to something like this. He had enjoyed his youthful pleasures, believing he was still a man full of life, but now he had to face the consequences of his actions. The chief sighed heavily. "This is a grave matter. According to our tradition, when a child bears another child for her father or grandfather, she becomes their wife. But this situation is different. Iffy did not willingly engage in this act. It was a mistake, an unfortunate accident." The villagers nodded, whispering among themselves. Some pitied Iffy, others were disgusted by the revelation. A few looked at Grandpa with judgmental eyes, though he had not intentionally caused this. Iffy's mother wiped her tears. "Chief, I cannot let my daughter live with this shame. We must find a way to undo this." The chief sighed again. "There is only one solution. The child must be aborted." Gasps filled the air again. Abortion was rarely spoken of in the village. It was a taboo subject, something that was considered unnatural. Grandpa immediately shook his head. "No. I cannot let this child die. Iffy's life will be at risk if she undergoes such a thing. She must carry the child and give birth." Iffy's mother clenched her fists. "And then what? Let my daughter raise her own brother or sister. This is madness. The whole village will laugh at her. She will never live a normal life." The chief raised his hand for silence. "This is not a decision to be made lightly. We must consider the health and future of the girl." Iffy sat in silence, watching the adults argue over her fate. She didn't know what to think anymore. She was scared, confused, and ashamed. She had only been curious, only wanted to understand what Grandpa had been hiding. But now, she was paying the price for her innocence. As the villagers debated, Iffy felt a deep sadness settle in her heart. Her life had changed forever, and there was no going back. The night was heavy with tension. Ify lay on the small mattress beside her mother, staring at the ceiling. She could hear the faint murmurs of the elders still discussing their fate outside. Her mother's heartbeat was steady but fast as she held her daughter close. They had to leave, and it had to be soon. C<silence>N's mind raced with plans. The village elders had given them only 3 days to accept their decision if he had to marry her grandfather. If they refused, the consequences would be severe. Tradition was law in this land, and going against it was dangerous. But C<silence>N would not let it happen. Her daughter was only 14. This was madness. As dawn approached, C<silence>N made up her mind. They would leave that night under the cover of darkness. She had already packed a small bag with clothes, some food, and the little money she had. She would take Ify back to the city, far away from this nightmare. But escaping was not going to be easy. The villagers were watching them closely. If they were caught, the punishment would be grave. That morning, Grandpa sat outside his house, looking older than he ever had. The scandal had drained him. He had always been respected, but now, people whispered behind his back. He had brought shame to his family and to himself. And yet, he could not let go of his pride. He had refused to allow the abortion, saying it was against his beliefs. Now, he was caught between tradition and his own conscience. The second night came. C<silence>N had barely eaten all day, anxiety gripping her stomach. She held Ify's hand and whispered, "No matter what happens, don't let go of me." They crept out of the small hut, their footsteps light against the cold earth. The village was quiet, save for the distant sound of crickets. CŒND0M had memorized a hidden path that led to the outskirts of the village, where a small road connected to the main highway. If they could get there, they could find a vehicle heading to the city. But as they neared the boundary, a voice rang out. "Stop!" Torchlights flashed in their direction. A group of men stood before them, their faces stern. The elders had anticipated their escape. "Where do you think you're going?" one of the elders asked. His voice was laced with authority. C<silence>N0M tightened her grip on Ify. "We are leaving this village. I will not let you ruin my daughter's life." "You defy the ways of our ancestors," the man questioned. "Yes," C<silence>NOM snapped. "I will not let you turn my child into a wife for her own grandfather." Murmurs erupted among the men. Some agreed with C<silence>NOM, others shook their heads in disapproval. The tradition had never been questioned before, but now, for the first time, it was. Then, Grandpa stepped forward. He looked at CŒND0M, then at Ify. His face was unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Let them go." The elders gasped. "This has gone too far," Grandpa continued. "What happened was a mistake, an accident that no one foresaw. My granddaughter is not my wife. She is a child." C<silence>NOM felt her legs weaken with relief. She had never thought her father would stand up against the elders. But he had. And his word still held weight in the village. There was silence, then slow murmurs of agreement. The men hesitated before finally stepping aside. Without another word, CŒND0M grabbed Ify's hand and ran. They reached the highway just as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. A bus was passing by, and C<silence>NOM flagged it down desperately. The driver took one look at them and knew they were running from something. Without asking questions, he let them in. As the bus sped away, Ify looked back at the village, her heart pounding. She would never forget what had happened there. It had changed her life forever. But she was free. CŒND0M held her daughter close. "We made it," she whispered. Ify nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Mama." They had won the battle. Now, they had to rebuild their lives. Parents, please watch what your kids do on the internet. Curiosity is natural, but without guidance, it can lead to disaster. Talk to your children, educate them, and be there to answer their questions before the internet does. A moment of supervision can save a lifetime of regret. Protect them before it's too late.